Okay, kia ora tātou, everybody. We've had, I think we can all agree, a rich and thought-provoking discussion on priority issues for New Zealand communities. And in this final session, we're going to broaden discussion to how the ambitions of our communities relate to New Zealand's hosting of APEC in 2021, which of course will bring together 21 very diverse economies, diverse in many different dimensions, and two of which, the two most important, or the two biggest of which, are of course locked in intense conflict with each other, which complicates the task even further. But they have a common interest and agenda which began with a focus on moving towards free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region and has been progressively widened to cover a wide range of issues relating to trade and economic integration within the region, including now a very strong emphasis on how trade and investment can contribute to growth, economic growth that is both sustainable and inclusive, which has been a large part of our discussion over the last 2 days. It's important to note that APEC explicitly doesn't aim at legally binding agreements. It's a consensus-based institution which aims at consensus, common understandings on best policy practice, which can then be reflected in commitments, voluntary commitments to policy actions and programs of policy actions, action plans, which can move the region forward. So there's a trade-off there. On the one hand, what is agreed within APEC is not enforceable because it's not legally binding, but on the other hand, because of that, it's often possible to get commitments on these policy programs that go far beyond what would have been possible if the participants had to sign on the dotted line and commit themselves in a binding legal fashion to those commitments. New Zealand, as the host of APEC, as each APEC host has the opportunity to prioritise issues within the ongoing APEC agenda and to target specific outcomes and also what we call deliverables in APEC. And our first two speakers are going to address two sets of the issues where potential APEC outcomes are of central interest to New Zealand communities. Chris Karamea-Insley, the importance of APEC to the Maori community, the Maori economy, I should say. And Stephanie Honey will talk about a set of issues which haven't been explicitly featured on the program, but which are centrally important to almost every aspect of international economic activity, the digital economy, and what APEC can potentially achieve there, given that this is also central to the conflict, one of the central issues in the conflict between our two giant members of APEC. And then finally, of course, the key speaker, Vangelis Vitalis, who is the chair of the APEC senior officials, who essentially manage the APEC process. So as the chair of the APEC officials, Vangelis is essentially the head of the APEC process, both inside and outside New Zealand. So he can perhaps respond to our two first speakers on how he sees APEC perhaps responding to their ambitions, their concerns, but also what we can expect from APEC in general across the board in terms of outcomes, or what we are aiming for perhaps in terms of outcomes. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Colin. Ka tira kia ora no tātou. Tuatahi miha tuki Ngāti Whātua, mo tā rātou nei wātea ki a mātou ki haramai i kōrero I rungi tōna rātou nei whenua, ka miha tuki te tipu na whare nei. I'm going to, firstly I want to just acknowledge to all of those of you in the room, trade negotiators, trade policy makers, trade in academia. And also, I just noticed the number of young people in the room. I'm really encouraged to see the number of young people in the room. What I'm going to do is I will land on some of the views that I have around APEC and the opportunity or not of APEC, certainly for Maori. I really wanted to take a little bit of a step back too. I won't be crossing over the points that Johnny McGregor's made about Te Taumata. I'm going to leave that with Johnny, and I know Kerry made a number of comments about the work of the Taumata as well. I'm not going to double up on that stuff. What I want to do is kind of just pick up onto what I think are some of the key themes that I've heard already, stitch those together in terms of how I think they play into the interests of Māori. I guess the first point I'd make is the topic, or the name of my discussion is for Māori is playing the long game. And that's, really the trade thing is really where we've been traders for 100 years, we'll be traders for 100 more years. And a lot of the way that we're thinking about this kind of trade agenda, and APEC is just a little milestone along the way in that sort of journey, is where are we going to be in 100 years' time? What are the things that we're going to be doing as Maori in 100 years' time? What are the products that we're going to be producing from our farms, our lands, in 100 years' time? They won't be the same things that we're doing right now. They'll be different. And so that's the thing that we're thinking through as we work with Vangelis and his team in terms of some of the FTA discussions that are underway right now, where are we going to be in 100 years' time? And then starting to think back, okay, therefore, what are the things that these FTAs need to embody to reflect the things that we want to see for our kids and for our mokopuna out into the future? While I might chair the Taumata, I take a lot of pride. I chair also some very, very small Māori trusts and incorporations, very small. And I want to use a little bit of an example. About 3 weeks ago, I was in a little town on the east coast called Te Araroa, and we were having our AGM of this little trust. It's a farming trust, getting its act together, doing a few things, and I'm the chair there. I'm ready to kick off the AGM, and we're in the kitchen. The kitchen was our boardroom, there's a really important point I want to make here, because it applies irrespective of size, but it highlights some of the differences in the way in which Māori think about business and Māori think about trade. And I'm ready to sort of knock the thing and say, right, 10 o'clock on the dot, we're going to start our AGM. And I said, oh, where's Carl? Carl's the biggest landowner in this particular block of land, and he's one of the trustees. And one of the nieces yelled out and said, oh, uncle, he's outside sewing up the dog on the back of the truck. Okay, all right. So the AGM is held up while one of the landowners is outside sewing up the dog that just got tuned up. His neighbor's dog, it wasn't even his dog, but he knew how to fix animals, and so he brought it over. AGM got held up. So me and my little grandson, we went out and watched this sewing this dog up on the back of the truck, and he had his daughter helping. And I guess what I'm really making the point here is Māori business is different. Don't think that because Māori business does things a little bit different, it's not sophisticated. One of the girls that was helping sew up that dog, she represented New Zealand around the world in polocrosse. She was incredibly smart, very sophisticated in her thinking. So I just really make this point that when we're thinking about trade and we're thinking about Māori in the trade space, we do work and operate differently. And it is incredibly sophisticated, but it's not well understood by mainstream. So that is one of the challenges that we have in terms of getting policy thinking embedded into things like APEC, things like these enduring FTA agreements. It's different, and it's probably our biggest challenge. We're always getting forced down our throats that mainstream is the only way to go. It's the only way to do business. But I'm going to hopefully demonstrate that that's probably COVID-19 has demonstrated the fragilities, if you like, of that mainstream kind of business model that prevails the world, the capitalist, if you like, business model. The world is changing. One of the other themes that I heard through all of the different discussions, and one of the points I want to make here is about speed. Whether we're talking about fast or slow, but speed. The world is changing. And in Māori, we're playing the long game. We've heard the discussion about inclusivity, and we've heard some other interesting terms that have come up today too, like circular economy and sustainability and those sorts of things. A point I'm going to make is those are things that we as Māori people have grown up with. They're embedded into our DNA. We don't need to learn new words like circular economy. We don't need to learn what, because we've got our own words for those things, and we've grown up with them. So we're already doing that. I'm going to kind of end with a view that trade policy is lagging. It's lagging behind, and this is the speed thing again. And then I'll conclude with some points about APEC. So COVID's changed everything. Yeah? COVID has changed everything. Product life cycles have shortened. We saw these before COVID. This sort of dynamic was happening. Product life cycles were shortening. You know, consumers were much more ready and prepared to switch easily, and digital technology is enabling all of that. So the point to really make, that I want to make here, is change is going to happen even faster as COVID, and everyone tries to recover from COVID. It'll be driven by technology, and it'll be driven by companies that are absolutely out there trying to survive. And so change will happen much, much faster. So a point I'm kind of leading to, policy has got to keep up with it, because policy lags. I've made this point that Māori businesses, our business model, in my view, is much more resilient. Through COVID, I make the point that COVID highlighted the fragilities of mainstream type of business. What do I mean by that? Māori business, in relative terms, through COVID and some of the companies that I lead, we've actually been recruiting people. We've lost no people through all of this change. Why? Does anyone want to hazard a guess why? Debt, in a word. Māori businesses carry very, very low levels of debt. And that's pretty much universal across all of Māori businesses. We have very, very low levels of debt. Those businesses that carry lots of debt or are leveraged up to their eyeballs when a crisis like COVID hits, they are immediately in crisis when the banks close in and start to foreclose on their debt. People start getting laid off, businesses start closing. Well, we're seeing quite a different phenomenon happening with Māori, fundamentally because we carry very, very low levels of debt. Therefore, we're much more resilient to shocks like COVID-19. There will be more shocks in the future. Our business model is much more resilient. I've kind of made this point already about playing the long game for us as Māori. We need to be involved in the discussion, and I'm hoping that Johnny has shared that that's really what the purpose of Taumata is, to make sure our Māori people have a voice into all of the trade negotiations that are underway, because our people have told us last year that they felt that we never had a voice into all of those trade discussions. Even though we've got an economy, Māori economy of $50 billion, and it's pretty much diversified right across the New Zealand economy, not just in primary sectors, increasingly up the value chains, etc. It's very diversified. Other important thing to note about that Māori economy, our Māori economy, it's growing faster than the New Zealand economy. It's growing very, very fast. So it will be a major component part of us into the future. Couple of other points I just want to underline again. We'll move from commodities through time into high value and up the value chain. So these are the things that we've got to be thinking about when we're promoting perspectives into the free trade negotiations that aren't happening right now. Likely into things that will be derived from what we're doing right now. There'll be derivatives, and that leads into one of the reasons in our current discussions with Vangelis and his team, we've got an incredibly strong focus on intangibles, or what's the other word for it? Intellectual property. So massive focus for us into all of those trade negotiations. Inclusivity, I listened to Carrie talk this morning about Māori women, the need for Māori women and diversity. Totally agree with everything that Carrie said today. But again, I make this point, in my own company, our team has just mapped out across our entire organization right now. That's the Te Arawa Fisheries group of companies in Rotorua and the investment group of companies that we have. So we mapped out our diversity. And what did it tell us? It told us that we're over 50% women in our organization, right from the very top, right down into sort of retail part of the business. We're unashamedly 70 to 80% Māori, and we're actually biased towards younger people in our business. So again, therefore, the pale, male, stale, an acronym that we hear about, business and governance, Māori are different. We're different to that. So, but we're also inclusive in the way we think about these points that were made in the last presentation about circular economy. We always have thought about not just the economics. Think about, doing good for the environment, really caring for our environment, our lands, our water, etc., and growing our people. But now there's a new word for it. It's called circular economy. Okay. And, people come and talk to us, wanting to come and talk to us about circular economy. But here's, I guess, my point about trade policy And that is, I watched an article, was it on CNN yesterday? No, it wasn't CNN, it was New Zealand. Nah, it might have been Britain even. And the point was that there's a prevalence of security cameras now. They're everywhere you go. Security cameras are out there and they're capturing all of this facial imaging technology. They're in the streets around London, even in the taxi cabs, airports, everywhere. And it's raising a big issue because there's all this concern about data, about individual personal data. But the laws are lagging sometimes, 5, even 10 years behind where the technology has moved on to. So this is the point that I make about policy. Policy too needs to start to reimagine what the future is like, trying to think, but it's always on the back foot, trying to catch up. So my challenge to Vangelis and the rest of the team is we need to be sort of thinking about how do we front foot this. In Vangelis's defense and to James Shaw's defense, I think there's some good things that are starting to happen right now. I didn't even know James was going to talk about these things, but I know James has been a leader of ACCTS that he mentioned, but there's also another one called DEEPA. And those are really good examples, practical examples of trying to get on the front foot of policy development around trade. And the point that James kind of walked through quite quickly that I think is most important is actually trying to find like-minded partners, that you're much more likely to get some stuff done than going through the normal UN kind of process that takes forever, or some of these other international frameworks that take forever, while the world is kind of sitting there wanting to move on. So policy is always kind of seemingly on the back foot. So I do applaud our New Zealand government. I do applaud Vangelis because I know he's been at the front of pushing some of this kind of different thinking about how do we make stuff happen faster rather than just being held back by the rest of the world. Another point that I want to make about the work that we're doing or Vangelis is leading and Te Taumata is sitting there alongside him on, and that is one of the fundamental drop-dead provisions of all of the trade negotiations underway right now is Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It's fundamental to every one of those trade agreements. We're so pleased that we're not having a big scrap about that anymore, that there is an acceptance that it is fundamental. I think it's one of the things that differentiates us anyway from the rest of the world. So that's good. So what would success in APEC look like? So we're going to have all these leaders. They're all going to be coming to New Zealand and probably, correct me if I'm wrong, Vangelis, but we probably won't see the like of APEC again for another 20 or so years. So it's a hell of an opportunity for New Zealand to showcase, in my view, to these leaders, what is it that makes us what we are? And how do we make ourselves stand out from everybody else? And I think we've got to be thinking beyond that, because, we can't just say we grow a sheep better than everyone else, or we grow a fish better than everyone else, because that's probably mostly untrue. That everybody else can grow a sheep just as good as we can, and they can provide milk powder just as good as we can, probably. So I guess one of the things that I've been championing is how do we actually make ourselves stand out? And it is really, for me, if you look at the All Blacks, when the All Blacks, they're a world icon. They're out there. How do they start the challenge with the rest of the world with a haka? And, they are internationally renowned for that. So I'm absolutely clear that it is our culture, is something that can help make us stand out from the rest of the pack. Just a little story I share with you right now, and that is, I don't know, in the last week or so, King Tuheitia in Hamilton hosted all of the high commissioners resident in New Zealand from around the world, about 20 or 30 of them. They all went to Waikato and they were entertained by King Tuheitia and all of the kapa haka and everything. And, it got to a point they were fed Maori kai, kinas and mussels, which is normal. And the person that was telling me this, he said, what was really stood out was in Maori, we call it manakitanga. It was the manaki or the warmth that these prestigious visitors, they felt, to the point where after having hakari, they were entertained with kapa haka, and then they were all up on the dance floor, all blimmin' laughing and carrying on. So they got to a point they were so relaxed and very keen to talk. So really, to me, is APEC that's really something that we can do, and we can do it well to engage all of these people, and given that we won't see them again for the next 20 years. So APEC, for me, it should enable certainly Maori, but I want to throw in as well other Indigenous peoples of the region, and to become much more globally diversified in everything that we're doing, and do it quickly. APEC should too find like-minded partners who have something that we need but we lack, but share our same values. They have things like growth markets, they have technologies, and they have skills and expertise. Finally, on APEC, it should not just be a simple talk fest with a whole bunch of people just sitting in Auckland, having a very, very narrowly defined discussion maybe about tariffs. I'm not saying tariffs are not important, because they fundamentally are, but there should be a much wider agenda for the APEC discussion. I'll leave you with this whakatauki from one of our growers on trade. He was referring to trade too, and it's nōku te whenua kei au te kōrero, nōku te whenua ko au te rangatira. And what that translated means, the land is mine. It is for me to speak. The land is mine because I am the chief. It's not for anybody else to speak on behalf of Maori in terms of all of these trade negotiations. Maori will speak for Maori. Only Maori can speak for Maori. Kia ora no tātou.
Kia ora, Chris, and I'm going to be very brief because, you know, we're standing between you and that very well-earned beer at the end of, you know, an intense 2 days. So I am going to give a kind of an ABAC perspective, I guess you could say, on what it is that we could hope to achieve in this coming year. But I'd like to start by saying, you know, we're incredibly fortunate to have fantastic Māori leadership, not just from Chris and Te Taumata, but also, of course, in ABAC, Rachel Talele, who you heard from yesterday. Shout out to Stephen Jacoby, the Executive Director of ABAC. And of course, last but very certainly not least, our disruptive trade visionary, Vangelis Vitalis, leading the APEC policy side. So in ABAC, our objectives, as Rachel explained yesterday, are tangata, taiao, and me te taurikura. And, you know, Rachel has talked about those. I'm not going to dwell on them, but I would like to highlight, as Rob mentioned at the beginning, digital. I mean, what can't digital do? If you really wanted to, you could use it to 3D print a bread slicer, let's face it. But I think, you know, in keeping with the theme of this, this conference, sustainability and inclusion can both be incredibly enabled and magnified by digital trade and digital economy sort of enablement. Inclusion, opportunities for women, opportunities for Indigenous businesses. Chris, you talked about the Māori economy moving up the value chain. We've got amazing companies like Matia Interactive, Robotics Plus, Straker Translations, Banker. We've got micro multinationals, Honey Consulting, for example, you know, making the world safe for trade from my kitchen table here in Auckland. On sustainability, you know, it enables a lighter footprint, whether you're talking about precision agriculture, the potential to decouple emissions and resource use from economic growth. 2/3 of the Sustainable Development Goals are directly influenced by digital technology. So, I mean, I think I've sold you, but if that's not enough, prosperity, our third pillar in ABAC, obviously, you know, there are trillions and trillions of dollars of economic value that can be created, whether you're talking about e-commerce, cross-border digital services trade, data flows, whatever. So what can APEC do? Well, it's a fascinating region for digital. It's got some of the biggest digital companies, some of the biggest digital norm setters, and of course, some of the biggest digital debates and most contentious differences in sort of philosophy around regulation, rights, how commerce should work, which makes it, you know, both incredibly exciting but also very challenging. I have great faith that Vangelis is going to deliver us a seamless single digital market in the APEC region next year. But as far as the business community is concerned, I think we really have great potential. That was a joke, by the way, to really address some of the sort of the digital noodle bowl, if you like, the divergence of technical standards, of regulatory approaches, of commercial models in this space, because as I think Rachel said yesterday, you know, APEC is sometimes called a perfect excuse for a conversation. Well, nothing needs talking about more than how we create a single digital economy for the world, for all of those great reasons that I've just talked about. And I think, has that been 5 minutes, Suzanne? That's all I've got to say anyway. Kia ora.
Thank you very much. I'm guessing I've got 5 minutes as well, so I'll be as focused as that. So look, I want to talk a little bit about APEC and the fact that it's our host year, and I want to talk about it in two parts. One, very briefly, to sketch out what it is that APEC actually does, and I think that's the first thing that we need to have in our mind as we look into the potential that we now have to use APEC to drive some of the things that are really important. By way of context, APEC has had a tough 3 years. In Papua New Guinea, it got really challenged because of a spat. Well, it was something more than a spat between the two major economies in the region, and that meant that we didn't get consensus around a leader statement, which is a very significant kind of backward step, despite the tremendous efforts that Papua New Guinea made to run that meeting and run it very effectively. It was a real privilege to be there. But yet the two major powers were not able to agree, and that really soured the atmosphere. Chile then took it up, but Chile's year was also scarred by domestic political protests as well, which meant that the leaders' meeting actually got cancelled. Into that stepped Malaysia, and then of course COVID hit Malaysia. What Malaysia has done has been an enormous service to the region, which is to have stabilised the institution and delivered a set of remarkable consensus statements, including a leader statement and, crucially, the Putrajaya Vision 2020. That's crucial for us as chair, because that is the document, that one-page document that we will take and convert into what is our major task for 2021. That is the conversion of the vision into action, into the action plan that will then carry APEC forward for the next 20 years. This is an enormous responsibility that we'll be carrying. We hold the pen on what the region is going to do over the next 20 years. Of course, we have to get consensus and work that through. Now, what is it that APEC does? Well, APEC provides the ecosystem that delivers norms and standards. It's exactly what Rob said, and I want to acknowledge the work that Rob has done to support APEC for many years now. It is the norms and the standards and the incubator of good ideas that APEC has traditionally provided. That then gets picked up. It gets picked up in the hard rules, the so-called hard rules, in our free trade agreements. We couldn't have concluded the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement without the work that APEC had done on competition policy, on customs facilitation, on rules of origin recognition, on standards. That all built confidence. So a crucial thing that APEC does is it builds confidence. And boy, in 2021, we really do need to be rebuilding confidence in the international rules-based system. This is a good point at which to talk a little bit about what the New Zealand priorities for the year are. And there are really we've tried to frame them in 3 ways. Obviously, our overriding priority is to deliver for all 21 of us, all 21 economies, the action plan. That's our overriding priority, and that's my big responsibility for the year. Within that, we have framed 3 interrelated sets of objectives. The first is the trade and economy set of policies that we'll have to drive the recovery and then the resilience of the region over the next few years. And to be very practical about that, some examples that we're hoping that members will be willing to work with us on are to identify COVID-19 essential goods. There was a great declaration this year from ministers responsible for trade saying we should allow the free movement and not impose restrictions on COVID-19 essential goods. But APEC didn't specify what those products are, nor did it specify what services you might want to help move those products through the region. This could be something that APEC might do in the trade and economic policy area that we're thinking of. The second big priority we have, so trade and economic policy, then the sustainability and inclusion piece. And there's 2 dimensions to that I want to bring out. One is what we will do in APEC, and the second is what we will do in what we're calling APEC adjacent initiatives. Within APEC, what we hope to do is use the APEC mechanism as an incubator of these good ideas to build on APEC's existing environmental goods list. It's the only institution in the world that actually has a list of environmental goods, but it's now nearly a decade old, and there's only 54 items on it. So is this an opportunity where APEC could deliver, be the incubator of a longer list? And by the way, bring in environmental services. We have not updated environmental services since the 1980s. Surely there is something that APEC can again contribute in the way it has done in the past. APEC adjacent work in the sustainable and inclusion work is going to be what I talked about a little bit very briefly in the morning, so I won't labour the point. It is to build a caucus of economies that will support picking up the Indigenous economy and trade issues, not just in our year, but over 5 years, over 10 years, however long it takes us to make this a standard part of the APEC agenda. And on that, what we want to do is to frame, and I'm glad I've got my Canadian colleague here, we were looking to work particularly with Canada, with Chile as other. We've got the Inclusive Trade Action Group as a start, but we want to expand that, and we want to have an agreement on Indigenous trade cooperation. But we're not just going to deliver that as a top-down process. The work that we're going to do with Chris, with the Taumata, but not just the Taumata. And I want to go back to the conversation earlier. There are many other groups that we need to be working with. Ngāti Toki Whakarurura, Ruranga, I need to work on that, is another emerging group that we're going to be talking to. And, if I may say so, the various groups that Professor Barg identified are clearly ones that we're going to need to be developing as we work this process through. But the vision is not just about 2021. It's about the long term. It's about where do we want Indigenous economy issues to be in terms of APEC in the future. We clearly need it to be inside that. The third area is the one that Stephanie is very helpfully, and Stephanie's done a lot of work in here, which has really helped us think with some clarity, well, relative clarity, about some of the big challenges we face in the digital and innovation space. So that's our third stream. Specifically what we might do, that's a really big challenge because, how can I put it? The two major players in the region have very different views about how to think about privacy, confidentiality, security of information, the interoperability of their systems, and so on. So one of our big challenges is, I think, how do we bring together some guidelines, some principles, some standards that we could agree amongst the 21 that we would then look over in the longer term to bring forward. And some of the things that Stephanie's written about are actually going to prove very fertile ground for us to be thinking in that area. So look, I think the way so what I'm trying to convey is we have a distinct responsibility to deliver the action plan. That is the significant priority for New Zealand in the year. Then we have a set of New Zealand priorities that we're looking to advance, both within APEC, but also APEC adjacent. 2021 is going to be a very challenging year. There's going to be lots of uncertainty. We've still got a health crisis. We've still got an economic crisis. But, and you know I was going to say this, Thucydides reminds us that during a time of turbulence, that is a stern test, he wrote 2,500 years ago, of the resilience of states. And I think next year is going to be a very, very stern test indeed of New Zealand, but I am confident that we have both an immediate-term plan, a medium-term plan, and a long-term strategy to bring all these things together in a way that delivers actually not just for New Zealand, but for the region itself. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vangelis. That was a magnificent panorama delivered in about 6 minutes. Absolutely. So over time, yes. Well, it was worth it. I believe we're out of time, so we will not have time for questions, unfortunately, but I'd like to ask you to again express your thanks to the three speakers, and I'll turn the floor over to Jennifer and Vangelis, I think.